Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of The Chord. Now, right through the month, The Chord, we have for you something which is going to explode your senses wide for one reason. We're talking about the Beatles. Now, if you were in the era where the 1964s, 70s really influenced the kind of music that you loved, let me tell you, Beatlemania just followed immensely after that. So, what we have for you today and also right through the month on The Chord is the band called the Beatles. Now, when you think of the Beatles, you really know that rock and roll was fashioned out of this rock that they had, and their bass is what really mattered. Now, listening to the kind of music that they played eventually, the kind of music they were playing previously, one thing you need to understand about the Beatles is the fact that they didn't just jump on the scene immediately. What they did was play, hone their skills, and then try to find out what really motivated them to make the kind of music they wanted to make. Influential, of course, the influence that they had on themselves came from, of course, Buddy Holly, Buddy Guy, people who were doing the blues in the American backwaters back then. But eventually to come and make the kind of music that they wanted to, they honed their skills by playing in dirty clubs in Hamburg and places like that for almost 5 years before anybody even knew them as the Beatles. But when they started as the Quarrymen. Now, when you have four friends coming together and starting a band, you need to understand that the kind of rivalry that happens within the band also is kind of influential in the kind of music that they make. Now, in the beginning, there was just Paul McCartney, it was, of course, Harrison, and then Lennon who came in together. They were from Liverpool, young boys who wanted to make music, and that was about it. They came, started playing together, realized that they had this kind of effect on each other. They knew the vibe was right. They decided to form a band. Of course, they did form the Quarrymen in the beginning. But what they had with the problem was that they didn't have someone who could be a good drummer. Pete Best came into the band and decided to do something about it. But till the time Brian Epstein came and became the producer, nothing really happened for the Quarrymen. They were about to become the Silver Beatles. Now, if you talk about the Beatles and what kind of music really influenced them, of course, it was the blues back then from the American backwaters. But then eventually they decided to do something that was even funkier. Their lyrics decided to change. They started playing in these clubs. But you have to imagine this. Before 1961, they were known as the Quarrymen. For 5 years, they played together in Hamburg in one of the most seediest places you can imagine, the red light area, and they played to some rowdy crowds who didn't even listen to their music. But what happened was they were honing their skills slowly. The money was bad, they were almost on the road, but then they didn't care about it. But when they came back 5 years later, in 1961, back to Liverpool, people started listening to them carefully because their sound and their lyrics had to make a difference. That's what the beginning of the Beatles was. But eventually, they were not known as the Beatles, they were known as the Silver Beatles. Now, four names that come to anybody's mind when you talk about the Beatles, of course, it's Starr, it is Harrison, it's McCartney, and Lennon. Four people who came together. All of them are very, very proficient while playing the guitars. They can play the lead, they can play the rhythm, they can play the bass, they can do everything. But also importantly, they can sing and also pen lyrics. These four guys from Liverpool came together and formed the Quarrymen that would eventually become the Beatles. Now, when the Quarrymen started, these four guys came together as friends. They didn't really know where they were going to head, but this is before Harrison even came onto the scene. The other three Beatles used to perform together, but they always had a problem with a drummer. Pete Best for a long time came and played on the drums and helped them out in whatever they wanted to do. But they claimed that Pete Best was not good enough because he was popular, more popular than anybody else in the band at that point of time. And that created friction. And when friction happened, eventually what does happen is people fall apart. And that's what happened to the band. But the band did not fall apart. One man left the band, and that was, of course, Pete Best. Now, understand this, before they even became the Beatles, they were called the Silver Beatles, and before that they were called the Quarrymen. Now, they came together to play music, but they were not popular. But what happened was for about 5 to 6 years, they sat and just started playing and playing and playing, dishing out lyrics, building up their repertoire eventually. But they went to Hamburg for 5 years, played in the seediest clubs you can imagine. They were not even known for their music. The rowdiest people around there listened to what they had to sing and said, okay, you're playing what you're playing, but that's it. They were paid peanuts. They didn't even have a manager. But after 5 years, when they came back to Liverpool, people started taking notice of these guys called the Quarrymen, eventually became the Beatles. Now, Beatles was a band that was experimenting. They didn't want to sit down and just listen to what other people had to play, but they decided to do what they had to do for themselves. But they needed a manager. And the manager was Brian Epstein. He came, noted these guys and said they are going to become famous. And Brian Epstein tried their best to get them record labels everywhere. Any record label worth the salt at that time just put them down as saying they will never make it big in any arena. That was only till the time Parlophone Records, a branch of EMI, gave them a chance to make it big. With Please Please Me, everything changed. The Beatles had hit the big time. Next week on The Chord, we're going to talk more about the Beatles or what makes them rock. But till then, stay safe. I will see you again next week on The Chord for more on the Beatles, but only on Rosebowl.